The frost still clung to the ground when I saw her for the first time, crouched in the far corner of a half-empty stock pen. Her dress hung in rags, her bare feet pressed into the frozen dirt wrists, bound in rawhide cut deep into her skin. Most of the men had already left with their purchases, laughing as they hauled their wagons toward the road. But she remained the one no one would buy. A streak of dried blood traced from her mouth to her jaw, and the traders had started calling her worthless. She looked up only once, and when her dark eyes met mine, there was no plea in them, only the kind of pride that holds a person upright when everything else is gone. I didn't go there to look at women. I went for grain and harness leather, but before I knew it, I was standing at the gate with 2 silver coins in my hand. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I've worked this land on the far side of Lobo Crossing for near 20 years, through dry summers that split the earth and winters that buried the fence posts in snow. I came up rough but honest, taught by a father who believed a man's worth was measured in his word and the calluses on his hands. Sundays were for church if the weather allowed, or reading scripture by lamplight if it didn't. We took care of our neighbors because one day we'd need them to take care of us. That was the rhythm I carried into my own life until the day the ground froze hard and I laid my wife and my boy in it within the same week. Since then, my world had narrowed to chores, the dog at my heel, and the quiet of the ridge. Lobo Crossing had changed in those years. The same main street still held the post office, the feed store, and a saloon that never shut its doors. But the faces were different. Railroad men and land agents had moved in, talking fast, carrying purses heavier than most folks' whole year's earnings. The trading yard had grown busier with stock deals and freight wagons. I kept my distance. I didn't trust the way money could turn a neighbor into a speculator or a handshake into a trick. My needs were few, and my coin stayed close. That morning I'd meant to be in and out before noon, but Frost and fate had other plans. I'd seen plenty of sorrow in the yard, over the years, folks selling off mules they couldn't feed, women bound for houses they didn't choose. But there was something different about the way she held herself, even with her dress torn and her skin marked from rough handling. She wasn't begging for mercy or making promises. She was simply waiting like the next thing would happen, whether she fought it or not, and she'd meet it standing. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew the traders were wrong about her. Worthless is a word men use when they can't own something. When the coins left my hand, the trader cut her bonds and stepped back quick as if she might spring at him. She didn't. She just stood stiff from the cold, her eyes steady on me. I stepped aside to let her pass, feeling the weight of more than a purchase in the air between us. We left the yard without a word, the wagon creaking under us, the road home running white and hard under the winter sun. By the time the hills closed in around the ranch, the sky was turning the color of pewter. I led the team into the yard, unhitched them, and hauled the grain into the shed. When I came back out, she was gone. My eyes searched the tree line, the ridge beyond, but I didn't call after her. Inside, I stoked the fire and set a plate near the hearth. The light from the flames threw long shadows across the room as I sat by the window, watching the frost gather on the glass. Somewhere in the dark, footsteps might already be turning back toward the cabin. The night she returned, the wind had a bite that cut straight through the chinks in the cabin walls. I'd been sitting by the window, the fire throwing just enough light to keep the room from feeling hollow, when the crunch of frost broke the stillness. She stepped into the doorway, without a word. Shoulders hunched, legs scraped from brush, her eyes giving nothing away. She went straight to the hearth, holding her hands out to the flames, the smell of wood smoke and cold air clinging to her. I slid a plate across the floor toward her. She sat with her back to me and ate in silence, every bite measured her breathing, steadying with the heat. She slept close to the fire that first night, curled tight under the wool blanket I'd given her. I'd left the cot in the back room open for her, but she never looked that way. When I rose before dawn, she was still there, one arm folded beneath her head, the other tucked to her ribs. I stoked the fire and stepped outside into the brittle cold. The frost popped under my boots as I crossed to the barn, the dog trailing behind, tail low, as though he knew the quiet inside had changed. By the time I came back in, she was sitting on the blanket with her knees drawn up, hair loose around her face. I set a basin of hot water near her, no words between us. She looked at it then, at me, and when I turned to the pantry, I heard the faint splash as she began washing the dirt and dried blood from her hands. That was how it went for the next several days. I'd leave food near the hearth each morning, take my own meal across the room. She kept to herself, but small things began to change. The floor swept, a chair pushed back in place, a nail hammered flat in the plank by the door. On the third day, she took to sitting on the porch while I split wood, her eyes following the rhythm of the axe. When I came back from the barn that afternoon, the loose nail near the step was gone, driven flush into the board. I said nothing, but later found her lying on the cot, instead of the floor, still keeping her back to the wall. That evening I found her at the front window, looking out at the ridge as the sun slid behind it. I stepped beside her. She lifted a hand toward the slope beyond the barn. "Graves?" she asked. I nodded. "My wife, my boy." She didn't press for more. The next morning she wore a wool dress I'd brought from town, not new, but sound. The fabric hung loose at the shoulders, yet fit close over her hips. She kept her eyes down as she worked at the stove, adjusting the hem with careful fingers when she felt my glance. That afternoon she came with me to gather kindling, following a few paces behind, watching how I worked, copying my motions. When she bent for a branch and winced, I started toward her, but she lifted a hand, more caution than refusal. So I stepped back. In the barn that evening, I sat at the workbench, patching a broken bridle. She stood in the doorway a long moment before crossing over to mend a tear in the saddle blanket. Her stitches were rough, but held. It was the first time we worked side by side. At supper, she sat across from me, hesitating before she took the first spoonful of stew, as though waiting for some unspoken rule to be named. Halfway through, she asked, "Why me?" I didn't answer right away. "You didn't beg?" I said finally. She studied me for a moment, then finished her bowl in silence. Snow began to fall heavy the next morning, wind driving it hard against the cabin walls. I set the kettle on the stove while she sat on the cot, legs folded under her hair still damp from washing. A red mark along her collarbone caught the light as she adjusted the dress. Our eyes met for a moment too long before I handed her a mug. The silence between us had shifted. It carried shape now. Weight neither of us tried to break. By mid-afternoon, the snow was piling thick, muting the sound of the valley. We worked together to close up the barn, her moving easily between the stalls, handing me tools without asking, brushing down the mare with practiced strokes. She said her mother's brother had kept horses and left the rest unsaid. Back inside, she stirred the pot over the fire, placing a third bowl on the floor for the dog. I noticed the scrape on her ankle when she shifted the hem of the dress riding up. She didn't cover it, and I didn't comment. Later, as the fire settled low, she spoke quietly. "I thought you'd want what others did." I shook my head. "That's not why I brought you here." Her reply came without hesitation. "I know that now. I didn't then." I took a shawl from the peg and set it over her shoulders. Her fingers brushed mine as she drew it close, and neither of us moved away. The next day, she fixed the latch on the feed bin without being told. That evening, she sat nearer to my chair, the space between us smaller than before. No words passed, but there was no need. The storm would pass, and with it perhaps the last of the distance she kept between herself and this place. The snow deepened over the next day, closing the valley under a white stillness that made every sound carry. I rose early to bank the fire and check the barn, my breath clouding in the frigid air. Tiva was already awake, sitting on the cot, with her hair loose over her shoulders, watching the frost melt on the window glass. We ate breakfast without hurry, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. By midday, the wind eased enough for us to work outside. She walked beside me to the barn, bundled in the coat I'd lent her, sleeves long past her wrists. Inside, she moved without being told, measuring oats into buckets and testing the water in the troughs. She brushed the mare with long, steady strokes, her touch sure. "You've done this before," I said. She nodded once. My mother's brother kept horses. Her eyes stayed on the mare, and I didn't ask more. That afternoon, she swept the porch while I split logs. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine, and the steady thud of the axe filled the yard. After a while, she set the broom aside and walked over. "Can I try?" she asked, glancing toward the axe. I handed it to her, watching as she adjusted her grip and set her stance. The first strike glanced off, but she reset her feet, and by the fourth, a log split clean. She stepped back, cheeks flushed from the effort, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. That evening, we sat by the fire, the cabin warm against the cold pressing in from outside. She rubbed a sore spot on her ankle. The hem of her dress shifted just enough to show a healing scrape. I kept my eyes on the piece of leather I was working, but I saw her glance my way. "I thought you'd want what others did," she said after a moment. I shook my head. "That's not why I brought you here." She nodded slightly. "I know that now. I didn't then." I took a heavy shawl from the peg and set it over her shoulders. Her fingers brushed mine when she pulled it close. The following morning, she was the first to rise. I came in from the barn to find her clearing the ashes from the stove and folding the blanket she'd used. The wool dress fit her better now, her frame filling out from steady meals. "Snow's lighter today," I said. She met my eyes and answered, "I can help feed." I handed her a smaller coat, lined and warm, and together we crossed the yard, the dog limping along behind. Later that day, she found me at the table with a tin cup in hand. "Teach me words," she said, her voice low but clear. I pointed to myself. "Gideon." She touched her chest. "Tiva." I named what was in the room, stove chair door, and she repeated each one, her brow furrowing when she stumbled. She laughed once at a mistake, a sound quick but warm. When I asked if she wanted to stay, her answer was plain. "I stay because I choose not, because I am kept." That night, she walked past me on her way to the cot, paused, and leaned down to press her lips to my cheek. It was not hurried, not uncertain. When she laid down her back to the wall, I stayed by the stove a while longer. The room quiet except for the pop of the fire and the wind moving along the eaves. The days after passed in the same quiet rhythm, the kind that settles in when two people work side by side. She fixed the latch on the feed bin without being asked. I mended her boots where the stitching had worn. She began to wait for me by the door when I came in from the cold, her shawl around her shoulders. A question in her eyes that didn't need words. One evening, while the snow drifted thick outside, she asked where my family was buried. I told her about the ridge behind the barn under the cottonwood. "You live here alone since?" she asked. I nodded. 5 years. She set her cup down, pulling the sleeve of her dress lower to cover her arm. "I was traded away 2 winters ago," she said. "Once to a man who beat me. Once to a man who tied me for 3 days. The firelight caught the edge of a scar along her shoulder as she spoke. They called me cursed for speaking out. I didn't move, letting her say what she wanted. She met my gaze, her voice steady. "I stay because I'm not afraid here." That night she stirred the stew while I set out the bowls. She placed a third on the floor for the dog, then sat across from me. We ate without hurry, the warmth from the fire holding back the winter pressing at the door. It was near dark when we stepped out to close up the barn. She walked ahead of me, the lantern light spilling across the snow. Inside, we worked without speaking, the creak of the wood and the shuffle of hooves filling the air. Back at the cabin, she hung her coat by the door and moved to the fire, her hair catching the glow as she bent to add a log. I watched her settle into the chair across from mine, her shoulders easing as she pulled the shawl closer. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the sound of something distant, a faint, uneven crunch in the snow that didn't belong to the night's stillness. I stood and crossed to the window, the glass fogged from the heat inside. A dark shape moved slowly along the edge of the yard. The shadow moved slow along the edge of the yard, dark against the snow. I stepped away from the window, took the lantern from its hook, and opened the door. The wind slid past my collar as I stepped onto the porch. The figure stopped short of the corral head lifting to meet the light. It was a stray mule ribs showing under a dull coat steam rising from its breath. No saddle, no halter, just the marks of a hard run in deep snow. I tied the mule inside the barn, gave it water, and set hay in front of it. Tiva stood in the doorway, haul pulled tight, watching in silence. It came in from the east ridge, I told her. She glanced that way, then back at the mule. Belonged to someone. I shrugged. Not anyone I know. She didn't ask more, but when I latched the stall, she stayed near, eyes still on the animal as though it carried news from somewhere far off. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a hard crust over the drifts. We worked side by side to clear the path to the woodpile, the sound of shovels cutting into the ice. She didn't seem winded, her movements steady and deliberate. Inside, while the kettle heated, she picked up the mending without being asked. The quiet between us had changed. It wasn't caution anymore, it was something settled, though unspoken. A few days later, I found her near the lean-to, sitting by a small chest I hadn't touched in years. She looked up as I stepped closer, her hand resting on the carved lid. "This is hers?" she asked. I nodded. "My wife's?" Tiva's gaze didn't waver. "Do you want me to leave it closed?" I shook my head. "It's all right." She lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay folded shawls, a hairbrush, a small Bible, and a dried bouquet bound with faded ribbon. On top was a photograph, my wife standing beside our boy, both smiling into the sun. Tiva held it with care. "Your son Micah," I said. 6 years old? My voice caught on the rest. He fell from the bluff. She looked down at the photograph a long moment before speaking. "I lost a brother to the river. He was 8. We stood without speaking, the cold seeping in through the open doorway. She set the photograph back and closed the lid. "I won't take a place that belongs to her." I met her eyes. "You're not taking anything." That night, the fire burned low as she sat across from me, the comb from that chest resting in her lap. "You want me to have this?" she asked. I nodded. She brushed a strand of hair back, the light catching her face in warm tones. The dress she wore had slipped lower at one shoulder, but she didn't adjust it. I didn't look away. When she rose for bed, she paused by my chair. This time, her lips found mine, slow, unhurried, and certain. My hand lifted to her wrist just long enough to let her know I was there. From then on, she no longer kept distance in the small spaces we shared. In the barn, she moved close enough to hand me a tool without stretching. At the stove, we traded places without either stepping back too far. She asked questions now about the land, the cattle, the ridges beyond the cottonwood. I answered each one plain, and when I didn't know, I told her so. One afternoon, as the light was going, we walked the ridge to the graves. The snow there had thinned, showing the fence posts and the stones. She stopped between them, her hands at her sides. "This one?" she asked, pointing to the left. "Micah," I said. She knelt, fingertips brushing the cold stone. "I would have fed him," she said softly. "Told him stories." I stood quiet, the cold biting through my coat. When she rose, she looked at me. "Do they rest easy now?" I think they would have liked you, I answered. Back at the cabin that night, she moved about the table, setting out bowls with a kind of ease I hadn't seen before. As we ate, she spoke of wanting fabric for dresses she would choose herself. I said we'd ride to town come spring. She reached across the table, smoothing the front of my shirt. And what will they say? I met her eyes. Let them talk. I know who you are. Her lips pressed to the side of my neck, the fire casting long shadows across the room. The wind had picked up again outside, rattling the shutters. I added wood to the fire and watched her settle into the chair, the comb still on the table beside her. There was no uncertainty in the way she moved now, no glancing toward the door as though weighing her chances. I couldn't name exactly when that change had come, but I knew it had. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the steady burn of the fire and the faint creak of the boards under the winter wind. The mule in the barn shifted once, a low thud against the stall. I wondered again where it had come from and whether it was the first sign of something or someone on their way here. By late winter, the days began to stretch a sliver more light with each passing week. The snow on the ridge thinned in patches, showing dark earth underneath. The mule in the barn had filled out some from steady feed, though no one had come to claim it. Tiva moved about the place now, with a sure step, no longer glancing to the door as she passed it. She took over the baking, without asking, setting bread to rise in the mornings, while I saw to the stock. I showed her the ledgers I kept for the feed store in town, and she picked up the numbers quick, her handwriting clean and deliberate. In the evenings, she sat at the table, shawl over her shoulders, going over entries while I mended tack. The cabin felt different with her in it, less like a place for one man to pass time, more like a home being kept. Word traveled in Lobo Crossing faster than most rivers run. By the time I went in for salt and nails, I could feel the looks. A few men asked about the mule, but their eyes wandered when they thought I wasn't watching. Some said nothing at all, just tipped their hats and stepped aside. I didn't bring her name into it, and no one dared speak hers to me. One morning she stood barefoot on the porch, the rising sun catching her hair. She looked toward the ridge where the cottonwood stood, over 2 stones. She had never been there, though I'd seen her eyes linger in that direction. When I came in from checking the fence line, she said, "I want to see them." We walked the narrow trail as the wind moved over the slope. The snow was shallow up there, enough to show the fence posts and the smooth river rocks marking the graves. She stood between them a long moment before pointing to the left. "Your son?" I nodded. "Micah." She knelt, her hand brushing the stone. "I would have fed him," she said. "Told him stories." I didn't speak. The cold tightened my throat. When she stood, her eyes held mine. "Do they rest easy now?" I said I believed they would have liked her. Back at the cabin, she moved with quiet purpose, setting the table, the look in her eyes steady. "Over supper," she said. "When spring comes, I want cloth for new dresses my choosing." I told her we'd ride in when the weather broke. She reached across the table, smoothing her palm against the front of my shirt. "What will they say?" she asked. "Let them talk," I answered. "I know who you are." She leaned in, lips warm against my neck, and the sound of the wind outside faded beneath the quiet between us. The next weeks carried a rhythm: chores in the morning, mending or baking in the afternoons, the evenings by the fire. We worked side by side without needing to speak every thought. She knew where I'd be before I stepped there, and I learned the look she gave when she was about to ask something. It was early one morning when she came to me, a folded cloth bundle in her hands. She set it on the table. "I'm late," she said. I looked at her, not understanding right off. "My moon," she added. The words settled between us. I asked if she was sure. She nodded. I didn't know if I could want this. Not after before. But now, if it's true, I want it. I poured hot water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. "We'll find out together," I said. She drank without another word, her hand steady on the cup. The fire popped in the grate, the only sound in the room. There was no fear in her face, only a calm I hadn't seen before. Later that day, I saddled the bay mare and rode into town for flour and a latch for the barn door. She stayed behind without hesitation, saying she had bread to tend. When I came back, the cabin was swept, the dog fed, and 2 cups waited on the table. "You came back," she said. I frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" She lowered her gaze. "I've been left before." I reached into my coat and set a small wrapped bundle before her. She opened it slow. Inside was a pair of soft leather moccasins, no bigger than my palm. "For the child," I said. She didn't answer, just took my hand, her grip firm and warm. That night in bed, she lay with her head on my chest. "If it's a boy, will you name him Micah again?" she asked. "No," I said. "This one gets his own name." She smiled in the dark, her hand resting over her stomach. Outside, the snow melted quiet in the night. Inside, the fire burned low, the air between us settled like something that had finally found its place. By early March, the snow along the ridge had given way to mud, and the creek past the cottonwood ran faster with meltwater. The cattle bawled from the southern pasture, their breath rising in the cold morning air. Tiva moved slower now, not from weakness, but because she carried our child. Her hand rested low on her stomach when she walked, a habit she didn't seem to notice. I adjusted the harness on the bay mare while she folded laundry by the porch rail. She had washed the blue calico dress 2 nights before, and it hung soft from the drying. She wore it now, the fabric skimming her shape, the hem brushing against her boots. She didn't hide herself anymore. Not from me, not from the world beyond the ranch. On the first clear day of May, we hitched the wagon and went into Lobo Crossing together. The town looked much the same: plank sidewalks, dust in the street, the smell of coffee from the mercantile, but the glances followed us. No one spoke against her, but I could feel the weight of their eyes. We walked side by side to the general store. She let her fingers trail over bolts of cloth, choosing 2, one pale green one, with a faded floral pattern. She asked the clerk about thread and thimbles, her voice steady. A woman near the counter gave her a brief smile, and Tiva returned it with a nod. Back at the ranch, she laid the fabric on the table and began to cut. I brought her water and watched her work, the quiet snip of the shears filling the room. She wasn't just making dresses. She was shaping a life that belonged to her. That evening, we sat on the porch as the hills turned gold in the setting sun. She leaned into me, her head beneath my jaw. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. "Not after what they did." I kept my arm around her shoulders. "It didn't take you from yourself. You held on." She looked up at me, her eyes sharp in the fading light. "You didn't fix me." "I didn't try," I said. "That's why I healed." When the stars came out, she asked, "Do you want to marry me?" I told her yes, but only if she wanted my name, because it was hers now, not because of what I had done. She faced me fully. "You didn't save me. You saw me." I went inside and returned with a silver ring that had belonged to my mother. I didn't kneel, just held it out. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit. That night we lay beneath the quilts, speaking of the garden fence we would build of paint for the cabin of a swing under the cottonwood. Her hand covered mine where it rested over her stomach, and there was no question anymore of her leaving. The next morning I rose early to check the north fence. The sky was clear, but the wind had a sharp edge. As I walked back toward the barn, I saw a rider cresting the far hill, his figure small against the pale sky. He was moving slow, like a man who had come a long way. The rider came on slow, his horse picking its way down the slope toward the yard. I waited near the corral, the sun behind me casting a long shadow across the packed dirt. He wore a trail coat dusted from travel, and his hat brim sagged low over his brow. When he drew close enough, I saw he was older, face weathered and set in the lines of long rides. "Name's Caleb Rowe," he said, swinging down stiffly. "I believe you've got something of mine." His eyes flicked toward the barn. I thought of the mule. It wandered in a few weeks back, I told him. It was near starved. Caleb nodded once, not quick to speak. Broke from my string in the last storm. Figured it was lost. I led him to the barn, the smell of hay and horses rising warm from inside. The mule lifted its head when we stepped in, ears pricking forward. Caleb ran a hand along its neck, feeling the weight it had gained. "You've done right by her," he said. "I'll pay what I owe for her keep." I shook my head. "Not necessary. She's yours." Tiva appeared in the doorway, a basket of kindling on her hip. Caleb looked her way, his gaze lingering a moment too long, though not in cruelty, more in recognition. "I've seen you before," he said. She stood still, her voice even. "Maybe. I've been in many places I didn't choose." The air held for a beat before Caleb nodded and turned back to the mule. He stayed long enough to share coffee at the table. The talk was plain weather trails, the condition of his herd. Tiva moved about the kitchen without speaking much, but I saw her listening. When Caleb rose to go, he left a small bundle on the table. "For the feed," he said. I didn't argue. He rode off the way he'd come, the mule trailing behind. That evening, as the light faded, Tiva sat by the fire sewing one of the new dresses. "I knew his face," she said finally. "Not from before you, but from a camp I passed through. He wasn't the worst of them." She kept her eyes on the stitch, her voice calm. "But he was there when I was traded." I didn't speak right away. The fire popped and the smell of pine smoke filled the room. She tied off the thread and set the work aside. "I'm not afraid of him," she added. "Not anymore." The next morning we walked the fence line together, checking where the thaw had shifted the posts. The air was damp with the smell of wet earth, and the ground gave under our boots. Tiva bent to press the soil around a loose post, her hair falling forward. I watched her straighten her hands, firm on the work. Back at the cabin, she took the moccasins I'd given her for the baby and set them on the mantel. "They'll stay there until they're needed," she said. There was no tremor in her voice, only certainty. As the week went on, she moved with the same quiet resolve. She baked bread, sorted seed for the garden, and stood with me on the porch in the cool evenings, watching the ridge turn dark against the sky. The ring on her finger caught the last of the sun. One night after the lamps were turned low, she said, "When we ride to town, I want to stand with you, not behind." I met her eyes across the shadows. "You will," I told her. The days were longer now. The mornings edged with the sound of birds in the cottonwood. We were working in the yard when the dog gave a short bark and trotted toward the trail. A cloud of dust showed where a wagon was making its way down. It wasn't moving like a freight hauler or a ranch supply team, more deliberate with only one rider up front. Tiva shaded her eyes. "Who would come this far without sending word?" she asked. I wiped my hands on my trousers, watching the wagon draw closer. The man on the seat raised a hand in greeting, but his face stayed unreadable. As the wheels bumped over the last stretch of rutted ground, I had the feeling this wasn't just a neighbor stopping by. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, the dust settling slow around its wheels. The man on the seat set the brake and climbed down his boots, hitting the ground with a thud. He was lean-dressed neat despite the road, with a ledger tucked under one arm. "Name's Judge Hollis," he said, tipping his hat. "Been sent on circuit to settle a matter concerning you and the woman here." His eyes went to Tiva, who stood steady by the porch rail. We brought him inside, the air cooling after the long light of day. Hollis laid out a folded paper on the table, weighted at the corners with the salt and pepper tins. "This," he said, "is a deed of title signed and sealed, making over this land and its holdings to the both of you jointly." He glanced from her to me. "Word reached the county of what you've endured? Certain parties saw fit to see justice done without waiting for the slow wheel of petition." Tiva's hand rested lightly on the tabletop, her eyes fixed on the paper. She didn't move to touch it, not yet. Hollis went on explaining the terms, his voice steady as the ticking clock on the shelf. When it was done, she looked to me. I nodded once. She picked up the pen, her name flowing in a hand she had taught herself over long evenings by the fire. I signed beneath it. Hollis gathered his papers, tipped his hat again, and was gone, his wagon rolling into the violet edge of dusk. We stood on the porch as the last of the light burned down behind the ridge. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and far-off rain. Tiva slipped her hand into mine. "It's ours," she said, her voice low but certain. The weeks that followed were steady and full. We planted the spring garden, mended the last of the winter wear, and rode to town together when supplies were needed. She walked beside me, head high, and folks stepped aside without needing words. One evening I found her on the porch, the small pair of moccasins still on the mantel behind her. She looked out over the land, the fields greening under the lengthening days. "This is home," she said. "No one can take it." And I knew she was right. The fences, the fields, the low hum of the wind through the cottonwoods, none of it was just mine anymore. It was ours, built on the long road she had walked and the ground we had claimed together. Out here, justice doesn't always come with a gavel or a shouted verdict. Sometimes it's in a deed set down in quiet, in a name written steady on the page, in the knowledge that no one can send you away. If this story speaks to you, carry it with you. Tell it to someone who needs reminding that dignity can be reclaimed and that a home is as much about who stands beside you as the walls that keep you warm.